Welcome to the NB Debrief, where we cover stories from across the stolen territories of the Wolastoqey, Passamaquoddy, and Mi'kmaq. I'm your host, Tobin Haley. Today we are going to be talking about Policy 713, the policy on sexual orientation and gender identity, which sets out minimum requirements for school districts and public schools to create, quote, a safe, welcoming, inclusive, and affirming school environment for all students, families, and allies who identify or who are perceived as LGBTQ. These requirements include ensuring LGBTQ+ students are free from harassment and discrimination, that there are positive representations of queer folks in the school environment, and that students can participate in extracurricular activities in a manner consistent with their gender. The provincial government has come under fire for their announcement to review Policy 713, which was only put in place in 2020. Days after the government's plans were made known,
could I ask the Minister to commit to tabling a full inventory and report on the complaints received?
The Minister of Education, Early Childhood Development.
Thank you, Chair. I'd invite the member if she wants to see what I've received. Then she's certainly welcome to submit an RTI.
Mr. Speaker, I think that what we have to understand here is what the basic principle of what are the rights of the parents and what role do they play in education. And I think if we want to ask a question, then the Leader of the Opposition should say, you know, does she believe that schools should have greater authority over parents? Does she believe parents play any role in the school, in the upbringing of their children? And in the policy, in Policy 713, it's clear what it says in relation to not informing the parents, and in the philosophy in the schools is if parents come in, that things would be removed so that they weren't identified. But, Mr. Speaker, I think what's important also to realize is that there is a mechanism in place that children can have a privacy and a conversation with school guidance counselors. And if there are issues at home, Mr. Speaker, there's a mechanism in place that ensures that child has an ability to have the parents in the situation evaluated. That's how our system works, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Hundreds of New Brunswickers poured onto the lawn of the New Brunswick Legislature to show their support for this affirming policy.
When is it not the right time to teach love, kindness, respect, and acceptance?
Joining us to talk about the review of Policy 713 and the implications of the review are Gail Costello, a co-chair of Pride in Education and a retired educator, Dr. Casey Burkholder, Associate Professor of Education at the University of New Brunswick, and Amber Chisholm, Associate Director of the nonprofit Public Legal Education and Information Service of New Brunswick. We will first go to Gail Costello. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
So I think the very first thing we need to tackle is, what is Policy 713? How did it come to be, and what was it meant to address?
Policy 713 has been in the making for quite a while. It sort of originally started with a Pride in Education policy way back when we had like 26 districts in the province. And down in the south, Pride in Education wrote a policy called E9, and it was trying to address homophobia in the schools, and it was trying to ensure that teachers and staff and bus drivers and custodial, everybody was getting some training on that. Mm-hmm. It was carefully created. It was stringently reviewed and vetted. It went out to all the principals, and then it became official.
And it was consulted on by a number of experts, right? Educators, longstanding educators who are also experts in the needs of queer children and queer youth.
Yeah. Yep. And of course, you know, I know that Premier Higgs keeps saying, well, parents didn't know about this. Well, it's not standard that you run policies through parents.
Right.
If you stopped any parent on the street and said, name me 3 policies at the Department of Education, they wouldn't know any of them.
We can name one now.
Yeah, we can name one.
Yeah.
But they sort of made it sound like this got slipped in without parent advisory. All policies are created in the exact same way.
Right.
They don't do they don't do mail outs to parents or have public meetings every time they create a policy.
Right.
This policy was created in the exact same format as any other policy was, and they keep talking about how there was no parent involvement. The policy writers are parents.
Right.
The EECD employees are parents. Mm-hmm. The teachers are parents. Pride in Education is parents. Some of the LGBTQ2IA+ folks that vetted it are parents. So it has gone through all sorts of different parents. So that information is misleading.
And so just picking up on the theme of misinformation and myths, there are many myths circulating about what is not a very long policy document. You know, it's concise, it's to the point, but there are a lot of myths circulating about it, from the ridiculous about litter boxes in schools to just factually incorrect assertions about it, including something about drag story times. Can you just talk about how, like, Pride in Education and sort of queer educators and allied educators are combating these myths?
Well, like you said, it's a pretty easy read. I think it's 5 pages. And that's kind of including the references at the end. It's very clear. It's a very easy read. There's really not a lot of ways you can misunderstand it. So whatever information is out there, I would call it disinformation as opposed to misinformation. I think it's intentional. I think it's fueling people who have no idea. They've never read the policy. They don't even know what the policy's about. But there's a whole bunch of, it's come up from the States. There's a whole bunch of trigger words that are out there that are associated with the trans community, you know, the whole grooming thing and you know, what are you promoting, and the kitty litter. That could really be quickly and easily dispelled, but that's not what's happening. Our leaders are repeating these things and saying them, and so the people who have no education whatsoever on this topic are taking what they're saying and saying, see, we're right. And it's really dangerous, it's reckless, and it's really, really unprofessional, and it's harmful.
And I think that's a really important place to end. And thank you so much for your time today and for all your work you're doing on this.
Yeah.
Joining us next is Dr. Casey Burkholder, Associate Professor of Education at the University of New Brunswick. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So you're an expert in education, and you do a lot of work on queerness in education. Can you talk about the value of Policy 713 for New Brunswick's public schools?
Yeah, for sure. So Policy 713 just sets the minimum requirements that public schools are supposed to offer in terms of a gender-affirming and queer-affirming space, mostly for queer and trans students, but also for workers, including staff and teachers and administrators.
And so it's just the minimum standard.
Just the minimum standard.
And we heard from Gail Costello earlier, who talking about how it's just like, it's a 5-page document. Like, I reviewed it. It's quite short.
Yeah, it's actually really easy to review, and I would really recommend for people who are feeling quite nervous about what 713 encompasses to take a look, because it sets it out very clearly. Again, it's just the minimum requirements that schools are meant to set up for an affirming space for queer and trans youth.
And what do you think is animating the government's decision to review Policy 713?
I would suggest transphobia and homophobia. I mean, certainly we've seen in the news recently Kelly Lamrock's report that showed 3 emails sent over several months. And then also I was reading in the news just today that there have been 0 complaints relating to the issue of young people who are trans who are on sport teams.
Right.
So again, we're not seeing any evidence that people in the public are calling for change. So what I suspect is happening is transphobia and homophobia in action.
And certainly the Minister of Education, his interview with Information Morning Fredericton, where the language of biological males was used to talk about trans women and girls, was quite shocking.
Shocking, but also not surprising, because we see this kind of rhetoric coming up to New Brunswick from America. And so these are sort of conservative talking points that really have no place in our schools or in our government.
Right. And so we would be looking to leaders to sort of bring an end to that rhetoric.
No kidding, which is what Policy 713 seeks to do.
And it's so new.
It is
Yeah, it hasn't even got a chance to get its legs underneath itself.
In fact, if we're looking for recommendations, perhaps including more training for staff and teachers in order to action Policy 713, those are things that would be useful in terms of reviewing.
Yeah. Deepening its commitments.
Absolutely. And then giving people the confidence to create those spaces that workers and young people need in schools.
And so what are the implications then for students with this review?
Well, I mean, we have to wait and see. I feel quite nervous about what this review could encompass. Certainly what we've heard in the news from Minister Hogan, but also from the Premier, are discussions about washrooms, as you made mention of. We heard about sport teams. But again, there's no evidence suggesting that these are spaces where New Brunswick students or families or teachers or administrators are calling for change. And so I feel very nervous about what any kind of review, not based on research, not based on public outcry, what could this be, and what kind of, what a challenge might be for young queer and trans youth in schools. And it's already not a great space. This policy sets up an opportunity for young people to be respected in schools.
Right. That's it.
That's it.
It's not harmed.
And like honestly harmed less.
Harmed less.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then what about for teachers? I mean, certainly the implications of this review announcement for teachers, I mean, I think we're seeing some of the effects, the protests out in Handwell. I mean, what are you hearing about in terms of implications for teachers? And you train teachers.
I do.
Future teachers.
I will say that my pre-service teachers are furious, and they are certainly in support of Policy 713. We've explored the policy in my classes, like looking at how the policy takes up the notion of space, like where is 713 operating in schools? I think students are very excited to think that through. But then also thinking about the implications of 713 in terms of teachers are trying to create these inclusive and warm and safe and affirming spaces. And so to try to take away a policy that seeks to do that makes no sense, or to revise it in some kind of nefarious way.
Right. And just to end, just for viewers who may not be as knowledgeable about the language around affirming and safe, can you just quickly explain what is meant by affirming in that policy?
Yeah, so I think what the policy sets out in terms of affirming is to create spaces where queer and trans youth feel okay in their bodies, included in school spaces, but that includes things like the bus, it includes washrooms, it includes classrooms, it includes clubs and extracurricular activities. So in all of those different kinds of schooling environments, to feel comfortable, to feel affirmed or good in their bodies and in themselves and in their identities, and to feel a part of a school.
Yeah, so they can thrive.
Truly.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time and expertise. We really appreciate it. And we're going to be watching this closely.
Yeah, me too.
Our final guest today is Amber Chisholm. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
In your view, what is animating this review of Policy 713?
Well, we've been told that it's based on complaints that have been received by the minister and the department. Based on what we know about the nature of those complaints and the controversy around how many they've received, I think we can safely say that it's misinformation that's driving the review. Misinformation about what's happening in schools, what kinds of things we should be prioritizing from policy perspectives, and misinformation about the nature of the policy itself.
And what children need.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, you are a lawyer. Do you foresee any situation where the government could find itself entangled in another costly lawsuit if Policy 713 were revoked?
Very likely, yes, absolutely. I mean, lawsuits and human rights complaints are costly and lengthy processes, and they exist for a reason. They exist when people's rights and dignity are not being respected. And what Policy 713 does is enshrine in writing exactly how people's human rights and dignity should be respected on this particular topic when it comes to LGBTQIA+ youth or youth who are perceived as LGBTQIA+. So those rights don't go away when the policy does, but when the policy doesn't exist and the mechanisms that allow people to enforce their rights through the policy no longer exist, your next choice is to go to somewhere like the Human Rights Commission or a lawsuit.
And could just the sort of removal of it, that act of removing this affirming policy, elicit any complaints? Could that elicit a human rights complaint potentially against the government for removing the policy?
It could, very likely. Again, especially if the removal of the policy removes certain abilities for students to actually enforce their rights. For example, going by the gender pronouns and name that they wish to be referred to by, being able to access respectful and private washrooms that conform to their gender or don't humiliate them in front of other students. The policy establishes those rules. And without the policy and by revoking that policy, there is a tacit kind of message being sent that we don't necessarily have to respect those rights if the policy is revoked. And that very likely leads to implications where students are going to be in a position of potentially having to make a human rights complaint. Human rights complaints have to be made on the grounds of something having happened. But these things happen in schools all the time. We already know that students are bullied. We already know that students aren't always necessarily affirmed or respected when it comes to their human rights. And a policy gives them an option to go to administration and go to higher ups and help work towards how we can respect those rights. Without that policy, it is really the Human Rights Commission that is going to have to step in when major problems start arising.
Yeah. And now the conversation has shifted to the rights of students versus the rights of parents, and some leaders saying that parents have a right to know, or teachers have an obligation to tell parents what pronouns students are using or what name they're using at school. And so it's being pulled into this conversation about competing rights. What's your take on that?
It's such a tricky situation and such a tricky question to parse. The way that I like to talk about parental rights when it comes to rights in regards to their children, not in regards to the state. Parents have rights when it comes to how the state wants to intervene with their child, or take action, or take away children, or tell them how to parent their children. Parents do have rights from that perspective. When it comes to the relationship between a child and a parent has responsibilities and not so much having rights. Parents have a responsibility to keep their children safe. They have a responsibility to nurture caring relationships with their children. They have a obligation to provide for their children and make sure they're not neglected. I don't see how a policy like this actually pits the rights of children against the responsibilities of their parents. There is absolutely a debate and a question to be had around what happens when a child is not comfortable disclosing their name, their pronouns, or their sexuality to a parent. And that, I think, is a very, very, very tricky thing to unpack. I do appreciate that schools have difficulty navigating those situations. The policy is written the way it is for a reason. Children under 16 have the right to change their name and pronouns within school records with parental permission. If a school wants to contact a parent to ask for that permission, they have to speak to the child first. This is a safety and a safeguarding issue. Arguing that there's a proactive duty on schools to inform parents about a child's, whatever name they're going by, whatever pronouns they're having their friends call them, or whatever sexuality they might be saying they experience if they're an older child. I personally have a very hard time understanding that argument. I think that there are many other lenses we can look through to examine whether or not schools have a proactive obligation to disclose the social life of a child to a child's parents. Who is the child hanging out with? What kind of cultural or religious background do they have? What kind of art are they?
It gets dicey.
It gets very dicey. And I really do have a hard time understanding why a child's identity is somehow treated as being in a separate, distinct category in that way. And I think that the reasoning for that is fueled by the misinformation and the panic. The idea that these topics aren't appropriate for youth, or that youth aren't really trans or LGBT, and that they've been influenced in some way, and therefore parents need to be informed so that they can correct that or guide that.
This idea that it's this, what's the language we've been hearing around grooming?
Grooming, exactly.
Just so problematic.
It's a repackaging of the exact same argument that was made in the 70s and 80s about, gay teachers or gay people in locker rooms. It's the exact same argument, the exact same thing, just around gender this time. And it's very dangerous, as we know.
Yeah, for students and youth and families, right? Who, like queer families whose kids are in the school. I mean, these are folks that should be welcomed in the community and celebrated.
Yes.
Yeah.
And obviously we would love to see situations where parents and children can be open and honest with each other and can explore a child's identity together. But when that isn't safe, I do think that adults have a responsibility to consider what the child's needs are and consider what the child's wishes are, and maybe consider letting them explore that without proactively having a parent interfere on something where maybe the child's just figuring themselves out in a social setting.
Or a safer setting than home, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And then I guess the last question is, as a parent with a child in the New Brunswick school system, I'm alarmed that that schools will become less affirming and inclusive of LGBTQ plus students. What can the community do? What can we do? There was the huge protest at the legislature, which was beautiful and lovely. What else? What else can we do?
The biggest thing that I think we can do right now is contact our elected representatives and contact the Department of Education, because one of the major reasonings that we're being given for this review is that they're being contacted by people who have problems with the policy. And if they're inundated with people who have support for the policy, that argument begins to hold less water, especially when those complaints are full, we already know, of misinformation, of allegations of grooming, the kitty litter argument, which again, in my mind, is a repackaging of the same argument that if we allow same-sex marriage, people are going to start marrying their dogs.
Right.
If we allow people to identify as trans, it's just one step away from identifying as an animal.
Right.
That's not how this works. It's another way of kind of latching on to the panic and the misgiving that people who don't have connections to this community might have and giving it credence. So people should be reaching out to the Department of Education and to their elected representatives and explaining, why this policy is wanted and why it is important. We know, for example, that students report having better outcomes mental health-wise and socially in schools where they know that they have a policy that protects them.
Yeah, and academically, if your mental health and social welfare are taken care of, you're going to be more likely to thrive academically.
Or even attend school.
Yeah.
We know that students avoid school when they're being bullied.
Well, it's not safe.
Exactly. So telling the people in charge that this policy is important is really a huge part in this. But to support youth directly, I think that a lot of it is going to be community building. Reach out to the people in your community who are already doing work with youth and see how that can be supported. Tell the youth in your life, that they matter to you, and that if there's anything they need to talk to, that you are open to that and not going to guide them one way or another, just being there to listen. And helping them find the communities that they might need. If a youth comes to you and says, I'm having these feelings, I'm having these worries, and I don't know who to talk to, there are groups out there that are there to support trans and queer youth and can connect them with the community that they might be craving.
Would you be able to name one just for the viewers?
I would recommend Imprint Youth Association. They're on the board. I'm on the board. They're in the Fredericton area.
Totally Googleable.
Chroma NB is another one working in St. John that does really good work.
Say that again, please.
Chroma NB.
Chroma NB. So Imprint and Chroma. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time and expertise, and we'll be following this very closely.
Thank you. It's so good to hear. It's very important.
And that is our show. Be sure to join us next time. The New Brunswick Debrief is a partnership between the NB Media Co-op and Charlotte County Television, two independent media outlets.
Where'd you go? Did you move away? Or is this your mistake? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Was it the curse or the endless shade?